All right. Good morning. One second. I just want to make sure it's all right. Good morning. This is Odessa Wesleyan Church, our journey through the Bible. And this morning we're going to do a broad look of Exodus 25 through 40. We're wrapping up the book. We're not quite done with Exodus. We're going to backtrack a little bit next week. But just to do a reframe here, just so we're all on the same page, that the Israelites, for about a year now, have been gathered around the Holy Mountain, and they have done the preparation before they enter into the Promised Land. And so, as you're reading chapters 25 through 40, you see a lot of detail about a lot of religious objects there. And so, I want to use kind of a question and answer approach this morning. Is what does why all this detail, why all these articles, what do they need? Now again, remember that up until this point, the relationship with God was kind of very broad, I guess. That you would have, Abraham, communicated with God, and Isaac and Jacob, but it seemed not like on a regular basis, like a daily basis. Then Moses was called, and the people saw God's power, and they really didn't have a quote unquote religious what's the word I want to use? Not really religious actions. They really didn't have a religion. How to relate to God. God usually spoke to them. That was about it. But now the people are moving into more of an established, religious acts, more of a, to living out their spirituality on a daily basis. So we see here that, why was this detail? Again, God didn't want these people to just kind of create a religion on their own. That, it's human beings. Again, we talk about you put, 100 people in a room together and try to come up with an idea. I don't know if you ever been in board meetings or, town meetings or even, congregational meetings for a church, that if you don't come up with a clear plan, a clear agenda, and just let everybody try to decide, you kind of get chaos, don't you? Now imagine 1.5 million people, and keep in mind too that these people also, there is some Egyptians that went with the Israelites out of Egypt, so they're coming from a different religious background. And so you have to have this clear guideline, a picture of what is the true religion and what isn't the true religion. So God spent a lot of time instructing Moses and the people about, these religious acts. That if you notice, a lot of these things, were portable, because at this point they did not have an established home. That so a lot of these things, you notice there's mention of, poles that are attached to the different things. It had to be portable. And the same thing with when they put together the tabernacle. It wasn't a brick and stone building. It was a very large tent-like structure. And the reason is because they were going to be moving place to place for a little while. Also, these people needed a central place of worship to unite the people. We talked about how the Israelites, the nation that they would form, the central thing that held them all together wasn't necessarily their language or their ethnicity. What held them together, what identified you as an Israelite, was how you related to God, your religious practice. And so the tendency would happen that if there wasn't an established central point of worship, then you had 12 tribes, millions of people who were going to be scattered over a large geographical area. What would probably happen is, well, this is the place to worship. Well, this is the place to worship. This is how we do it over here. And you would start to have divisions among the people. And so God wanted the people to have a central place where they came and worship. And another reason is the idea of he wanted the religion to be consistent, that the practices that the tribe of Dan had were the same practices that the tribe of Judah would have, the same practices that the tribe of Levi and the Benjamins, and on and on and on. Every one of the 12 tribes would have the same religious practice, worship the same God, worship the same way, that their offerings, their festivals, all would have the same meaning. And even though you were of the tribe of Dan, you were still an Israelite. And to be an Israelite, this is how you worship. So that's why there's a lot of detail, and not just in Exodus, but as you look at Leviticus and into Numbers, you see a lot of detail, and that's why the detail was there. So we look at the list of these things, and you see the measurements that tables being made out of gold, and altars being made out of gold, and linen, this large, tabernacle, and all the different details there, the precious metals and the jewels and everything. And you wonder, these guys were slaves. Where did this all come from? And if you remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about the night of the Exodus, when the Egyptians told the Israelites to get out of here, that to remember a couple of verses because it was kind of important. So moving back to 12:36 for a second, let me read to you these verses. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and clothing. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people. They gave them what they asked for. So the Israelites plundered the Egyptians that night, and that the Lord brought them out of Egypt. So that's where all this came from. That you notice that these people could have kept this for their own riches, but when it came time to build the tabernacle, to make the articles of worship, the people were asked for offerings. Now that was probably a test of gratitude, because again, you had nothing. You had, for 400 years, you had been abused and misused by the Egyptians. And your God says, go to them and ask them. And the Egyptians said, whatever you want, take it. Just leave. Just leave. And they could have selfishly said, wow, I just went from a slave to a rich person. But instead, when it came time for God to say, okay, it's time to build your place of worship, it's time to create the objects that we use to worship God, give an offering. And these people gave out of what they'd taken from the Egyptians. And again, if you look at some of this stuff, you kind of do the calculations, which I'm not going to take time to do today. That was a lot that they had. So that's where this material came from. So what was this tabernacle thing they were talking about? In chapter 26 and 27 and 40, that God talks about building this tabernacle. And this was the central location of worship. This was the place where the Israelites worshiped God, where God met with his people. It was here, wherever the tabernacle would eventually be placed in the land of Israel, all the people would come on a regular basis and celebrate the festivals. They would bring their sacrifices. They would worship God. That the Sabbath would be celebrated here, at this tabernacle. And it was only here that the sacrifices were to be made to God, the different types of sacrifices. That eventually what would happen in the history of Israel, that starting with Solomon, that he allowed sacrifices to be made in other places. They called them high places. Some of them were made to the false gods of people, and others, decided, well, it's just too much to travel, to God's holy city, so I'm just going to worship God here. And that was the wrong thing. What God wanted was a central place of worship where all the people came together. And again, the reason was wasn't, to single out one certain area. The reason was to unite the people. The people were gathered on a regular basis and worship God together. Again, religion and their relationship with God was a central part of their nationhood. That would keep them united. And here, what the presence of God would be, this would become God's earthly home. So this tabernacle had three different parts. It had an outside court. That's where all the people gathered to worship. That it had an inner court. This is where the priests would worship God. They would perform the acts of worship by offering the sacrifices to God and doing the daily acts of worship on behalf of the people. And then there was this inner area called the Holy of Holies. This was the most holy place where the high priest was the only one allowed to go, and not on a daily basis. And it was here that God and the high priest met. Wasn't, our thinking of, the high priest is kind of sitting there, doing these acts. Literally, what the intention was is the priest would walk into God's presence. Think about that for a minute. The God that they saw up on that mountain, the thunder and the lightning, the God that defeated the Egyptians, the God that split the sea, would meet with the high priest one-on-one. That was the relationship they had with their God. That when the people came to the tabernacle, they knew God was there. They knew that the high priest was representing them to God. The high priest knew the great responsibility of his life that he had. The other priests who worshiped, in the inner court, who did all the acts of worship, who took care of maintaining the tabernacle, they realized this is a holy act. This isn't like something that you do because feet away, there is God's presence. And so this was a very, very serious thing. That this wasn't like, some idea, let's build a building and say that God's going to be around it. That literally God's presence was to be right there with the people. Now, that should really reform their thinking and their actions and their life. That we can get very caught up in, as we go, especially into Leviticus, and get very distracted with all the to-dos and don'ts. But literally, the people were to be holy. Because if this God of holiness finally wants to be with humanity like he was with Adam and Eve, then one, that high priest had to be in a holy life, had to live righteously. But then the people also, if their God chose to dwell with them in a human-made tabernacle, that should really change your actions and remind you. Now, unfortunately, as we move on this study, we'll see the nation of Israel over time, maybe because they took advantage of it, maybe it just got, just complacency, whatever may be the reason. We'll look at a lot of it. But eventually it was kind of, just an act. It turned into a building. It turned into just something that we do. And when that happened, the literal strength of the nation would fall apart. But that's for another time. So let's look at some of these articles here that God directs them to build. Talks about an ark. So what is the ark? Verses 25 10 through 22 and 37 1 through 6. This is not the first time we see this word here. Listen to these words in Genesis 6:14. So God said to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all the people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch, inside and out. Now, God's telling the people to build a boat. What? No, not really. The Hebrew word for safekeeping is very similar to this word used in Genesis for ark. That what this ark of the covenant, is what it was actually called, the formal name, was a chest. And this chest was meant for safekeeping of articles. One article that it had in it was the two stone tablets that God wrote on the Ten Commandments. That whenever the priests approached the Holy of Holies where this would be, he would be reminded in that ark is God's covenant with the people and the people's covenant with God. That he would be reminded that this is how to live. A jar of manna was also placed in it, that a, a promise of God's sustaining of the people. That you remember that they were to go out and gather the manna, and that was what they subsisted on. That this was also placed within the ark, and upon it was a cover, and this cover again was also another name of it was called the mercy seat, and this was a solid gold tabletop in a way, and on each side they crafted images of the cherubim, which were angelic beings. And the cherubim and the hierarchy of the angelic beings is they are the ones that are constantly in God's presence, calling for the congregation to worship God. That we see in different verses in Isaiah and we see in Revelation. That the cherubim are constantly flying around God's presence, acknowledging his holiness, calling the people to worship God. So here you have, if you can picture it, that you have these cherubim, and in between is this mercy seat. This was called also an atonement cover. And it was here, remember we talked about on the Holy of Holies, this is God's presence. It was here where God would sit before the high priest. Literally God's earthly throne. That the reason why it was called the atonement cover or the mercy seat is when the priest entered, he wouldn't just walk in and say, "Hey God, how are you doing?" That he would bring with him the blood from the sacrifices from the altar. And it would be a sacrifice, and the blood would be poured upon the seat. And the blood was the atonement for the people's sins and for his own sin. Because again, something sinful walking into God's holiness would be destroyed. But the blood of the sacrifice took on the sin for the people and was a reminder of God's mercy to the people. This would allow the unholy human, no matter what the human being did at this time, would not make themselves holy, as God is holy. But it would allow him to present himself to the most holy God. We also see a table. They were directed to craft a table, chapter 25, 23 through 29, and then chapter 37. And one thing I forgot to note, that when I list the two different chapters, one is God's direction, and then the other one is the fulfillment of it actually being made. So you had this table, and this table was in between. It was right at the entrance of the Holy of Holies. And every day, bread, it was called the bread of the presence, would be placed daily on this table. And what does it mean to break bread with somebody?
Usually
To
meal
eat.
with-
And
but
if
we
you're
break bread at communion too, because might not necessarily be a meal, but
right,
fellowship.
fellowship. What this bread of presence? Why they made this bread and placed it on this table in between humanity and the Holy of Holies of God was a reminder God's presence, that God wanted to fellowship with them, that God wanted a relationship with his people. And this was reminded to be reminded of it, but it was a reminder of the people that every day, as they eat this bread and they placed it on this presence, that God's presence is right there. And just as you would sit down at a table to eat with somebody, this table was your invitation to come to God and have a relationship with him. So again, a lot of unique symbolism here. But also this bread was a reminder that God was the source of their life. That bread was the main staple. That we can subside on bread and water for a long time. And bread was then, and I know some of us probably are on low carb diet or gluten free or whatever, but bread has always been, and throughout human history, every culture out there, some form of bread you will see. And that's a unique thing. I like watching some of the shows on like the Food Network that talk about the history of food. And I remember watching one of those one time where it talked about every culture from the time we recorded history. Every culture has some form of bread, and they're part of the staple of their diet. So again, this is a reminder that God is the source of your life. That God is the one that sustains you. It's not your acts. It's not your might or how good you are, but it's God who sustains you.
I believe I read from it. Perhaps the book of John, where it says, I am the bread of life.
Mm-hmm. Jesus says that. Yeah, there was a book on that.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, Jesus talks about that. That's one of the I am statements that Jesus made. He says, I am the bread of life. That literally, I am your life. I'm the one that gives you life, that maintains your life. And then again, as Christians, as Tammy just mentioned, if you were able to hear that in communion, we place a form of bread on the communion table. We don't call it the table of presence anymore. We call it Protestantism. We call it the communion table. But there is a form of bread, and we break it. And it has a symbolism of Jesus' body being broken for us. But it's a reminder that Jesus is our life. That there is no life without Christ. And so a lot of these symbols, as we move into the New Testament, we're going to relate back that these symbols, these different things of worship they use, were not isolated. They look towards the future as well when Christ comes, when God comes in human form to humanity, that there's symbolism there. And Jesus is the one, all these symbols and all these meanings of these different things in one form. He fulfills the meaning of each one of these. So we see mention of lampstands there in chapter 25, 31 through 40, and 37, 17 through 23. You see that they're told to make solid gold lampstands. Now, the tabernacle did not have windows. You had the outer court, which was wide open, no roof, and then the inner court, the same way. But the Holy of Holies was this large curtained off area. So it was dark. Now, our God isn't happy with the darkness. What was the very first thing he created? In Genesis 1:1. Light. Right? He said, let there be light. Because there was darkness before that. We use this a lot, that God is light. The God shines in the darkness, because in the light, everything's exposed, everything's in the open. Light is safety, light is healing. Darkness brings fear. Darkness brings, you know, almost a separation from each other. So God intended when the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, these lamps would be burning as a symbol of God's light. You didn't worship God in secret. You didn't worship God, you know, that without you being exposed, that you were in God's presence. You were in the light of God. And again, like I said, the light exposes. So the priest had to remember that he needed to make sure that his life was sinless, that he was living a holy life before he would enter God's presence. And these lamps would stay burning. Whenever the tabernacle was set up, these lamps would always burn. And there was a special oil used. You think, why was God concerned so much with this special oil? It said that there was a clear oil used. And if you've ever done like a first press of olive oil, you notice it's very cloudy. Now it has great flavor. It's great for cooking. But the very first press is not clear. You have to filter it and you have to press the fruit multiple times to get this special clear oil. So why was God so concerned about having this clear oil? Well, one, it doesn't smoke or give off obnoxious smells that would distract. That it wouldn't smoke, so as you enter into this, that if you've ever burned oil, you can, kerosene oil especially, has kind of a nasty smell, doesn't it? My wife, whenever the power goes out, we have decorative kerosene lamps, but that's like the last bit before we, get to that. We have to run out of every battery in the house that she just doesn't like the smell, which I don't blame her. It does have kind of a smell, but it also gives off a smoke, and that smoke is oily, and that can stain. And then even afterwards, you ever notice you burn a kerosene lamp or even like a kerosene heater, even a time after, you smell that, and it kind of distracts you. It kind of, that's not a great smell. God instructed them to burn clear oil so that when they walked into the inner court, when they walked into the Holy of Holies, they weren't distracted. That they were focused on God. That there wouldn't be the smoke to cover. You ever notice when you burn a lot of smoke, or you ever seen, when yeah, and just got that. When an oil well burn, catches on fire, it's the black clouds of smoke. God didn't want that to cover up. So that's why he was concerned, even with something that tiny. And we'd say, okay, well, we need oil for lamps and whatever. That, and here's a little side note: the reason why the Jews Hanukkah, why they have the menorah, which is the 7 lampstands, the 7 lamps of this one lampstand, that is a symbol of the original lampstands in the tabernacle and in the temple. And in the book of Maccabees, which is not a in the Protestant Bible, you very rarely see that. Some denominations do have that, but that's more of a historical account. Some people say a legend, whatnot. But the story is that during a siege of Jerusalem, these lampstands had to be burning, and that they ran out of the special oil. But for 8 days, by a miracle, the lamps kept burning. So that's why Jews celebrate Hanukkah for 8 days, and they light the menorah, is a symbol of that miracle, that they had that blessing of God's presence. So that's a little trivia, no charge for that. All right. So chapter 30, you see that God instructs them to make a wash basin. A wash basin. Now, why you need a wash basin? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is when you presented your sacrifice, you just didn't bring the animal that you were sacrificing and throw it on the altar, cut its throat and set it on fire as a sacrifice. There was specific ways to do it. One, you did slaughter the animal, but then you cleaned it and all the offal, all the inner organs that you disposed of, and then you would wash the meat so it would be clean. Because God, you were presenting God a pure, clean sacrifice. But also the reason, so you would use this wash basin to wash the sacrifices with. But also, it used it to wash the area. Because you can think about that if each family was to present, even Passover, okay, think about that, Passover. Each family, even if we say there was just still 1.5 million people all throughout, which we know, was born, on Passover, each family was to bring a lamb, and the priests were to slaughter that lamb. Think about the blood. Think about the blood. You had to clean up the area. So instead of just going and getting a 5-gallon bucket from Lowe's and dumping some water, again, this blood had a symbolic meaning of atonement, the covering of their sins, that there was specific ways. There was a specific reason. But then also, the priests would use this wash basin to cleanse themselves from the dirtiness of living, not just the physical, but to present them to God. Again, you didn't just walk into God's presence with dirt on your feet and stained clothes. You walked into God clean and presentable. That you took specific action, because at that time the outward acts that they did were symbolic of being allowed to be in God's presence. So that's the reason why they had the wash basin. Look at chapter 30, 1 through 10, and then 37 through 25. We see that God tells them to burn incense, and not just any incense. Again, a special formula of incense. So why was that constantly burning? That it was a special formula used exclusively for religious and spiritual acts. It was not a common scent that you would see. Now, again, the Bible really doesn't tell us the formula. And what I believe the reason maybe why it's not listed in the Bible is so the common people couldn't just make it and burn it in their own houses, or sell it or whatnot. Only the priests, the workers in the tabernacle, who knew how to make this. It was passed down. That. So think about for a moment, that smells. Smells trigger our brains in a lot of ways. If you walk into Gerlando's restaurant, what do you expect to smell? Pizza, lasagna, right? That if you walked in and smell burnt food, if you walked in and smell a steak, now I like steaks, but if I'm going to Gerlando's, I'm not eating a steak, right? I'm going to have a big old Italian feast. The same thing. That what God, again, being our designer, being our creator, that when they encountered this specific smell of incense, it triggered in their brain, I'm entering into the holy place of God. That this is what maybe heaven smells like. I don't know. That's me. That's Pastor Brian. That's not. But it triggered a reminder that you're in some place special, that you're not in common. Because if you smell that same fragrance in the market, you smell that same fragrance at home, you smell that same fragrance out in the wild, as you would in God's place of worship, it really wouldn't do anything, special. But this was a trigger to help you remember this is a different smell. This is a very special place. The priests would be, or when they were ordained, they would be anointed with oil with this fragrance in it. Again, the priests have BO. Well, back at that time, probably. But it also, when a priest would walk by, when you would come into the tabernacle and they would be there, you'd be standing next to them. This is a person, this in life is to bring the people to God. When the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, he would see the lampstands, he would see the mercy seat, the Ark of Covenant, and he would smell the incense to remind him he's in the presence of God. By God's mercy, by God's grace, not by anything this high priest did, not because of his birth or his name, or any other reason than God invited him into his presence. So, looking at chapter 28 through 29, why this special treatment for the priests? I mean, we see a lot of specifics here about what they were to wear, this very special act they went through, all these things. Why this very special treatment for them? That the priests would be the direct descendants, members of the tribe of Levi. Only males were allowed to be priests at this time. And they would serve as Levites. The Levite tribe, their responsibility was to guide the people in a relationship with God. They would eventually, they never had a specific region, a section, a state, a province, whatever the word we want to use, that was part of Israel. They lived everywhere. Now they had, remember we talked a little bit about the cities of refuge. That was the Levites' land. But there was a city of refuge in just about every tribe, every regional area. Within a day's journey of anywhere in Israel, you would find a city of the Levites. They had the responsibility to constantly disciple the people, constantly worship God, constantly guide the people in their relationship with God. Now, wherever the tabernacle was located, those Levites had specific duties. And what would happen over time is that the Levites would take turns. You would have, they called them divisions. So, certain times of the year, you would come to wherever the tabernacle was, and eventually, when the temple was built, and you would serve there. And then you would replace a group and they would go back home so they could do their daily duties. Okay? So these guys were not, singled out just by chance. This was what God said. This tribe, this is what they're to do. Now, Aaron, who was of the tribe of Levi, and his direct descendants were the ones to be the high priest, to be the leader of the Levites, to be the one to allow into the Holy of Holies. Now, what happened over time, especially after the Israelites' exile and the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the nationhood, is, and then in Jesus' time, and we see again, you'll see mention, and with the Apostle Paul, that the high priest was elected from the high council. The Sadducees, the Pharisees would get together and they would elect. Because again, the tribes during the exile became intermarried, intermixed. So there wasn't, a true tracing. But up until, the end of, what we would call the nation of Israel before the Babylonian captivity, that you could trace the high priest of the day all the way back to Aaron. That, direct lineage, that was you know, the ordination, that was the choosing of that family to be the high priest. Now, today we have this ceremony that when one accepts the call to ministry, that this person is ordained. And when you take on, you accept this ordination, this ceremony, and say, yes, I'm going to be a minister of the gospel, and this is my calling. It's a title of responsibility because you literally represent God to the people. And you commit to teaching them and leading them and how to relate with God. So that's what these priests, when they were ordained, they accepted. By virtue one of their birth, by virtue two, they accepted that their quote unquote job, their role in life was to help the people relate to God. So these people were given special garments, 28 through 1 through 5, that it wasn't, a uniform to, make them prideful. What this special garment was is if you're walking in the marketplace and you're dressed as an Israelite priest, your actions need to be different, right? Because who are you representing? God. And your words need to be different. And your values and your ethics need to be different. So this was a reminder to the individual priests that they were ordained, they were chosen by God to be different. So just like any other uniform, that the people also, this reminded them that here is God's representative. Now, it wasn't to be, you bow down to them or you gave them, you know, great acknowledgement or anything. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was when you saw a priest, whether it was the tabernacle or the marketplace or wherever it would be, you were reminded that God has a relationship with you, of who you were. So they would wear this, what they called an ephod. Ephod. In verses 28, you see that chapter 28. And daily, you notice here that it talks about stones. And there was 2 stones up here on the shoulders. And these stones did not have magical powers or anything like that. These stones were what they called decision. What these were was to remind the people when we needed to make a decision, when we had a question, whether it was social or economic or civil or criminal or spiritual, you were to go to the priest. The priest had the responsibility to make the decisions. That when they said, well, what does God say about this? The priest literally on their shoulders had the responsibility to guide the people to God, to guide them in their daily life. You notice here that God says, to inscribe 12 different types of jewels and put it on the ephod. The name that's described on there is each of the tribes, not one tribe, not 2 or 3, not all but, 2, but each and every tribe. The reason is again to remind the people it doesn't matter if I'm a member of the most powerful tribe or the least powerful tribe. God wants me in a relationship. This priest represents me to God and God to me. Equality. That again, that God didn't want the nation to split to say, we're more populous or we're more economically powerful than you are. So we get, we get first chance at God. We get first chance at the priest. No, that the priest was to bear witness to God no matter where they were, no matter who the people were. But then we see the high priest then had not just these garments and this ephod, but then he wore a breastplate. And this breastplate went over his garments when he went into the Holy of Holies. The reason again was to remind him when he put on this extra garment, again to remind him where he was going. That again, it wasn't, he was out in the common everyday world, that he was about to enter into the presence of God. And then in a way, even though God knows us before we walk in, but also was to remind God, that covenant, this is the man who represents people all the time to me. Really quickly, we see all this and we go, okay, these former slaves, how did they come up with all this stuff? And if you read some of the descriptions of this, you go, how, I'm not a craftsperson. My father really was. My dad, I would say, hey, I need this built, or could I do this? And he'd sit down with a piece of paper and scratch it. And he'd go and get the wood, and get the saws, and do all this. And I'd be like, yeah, that's good. That's what I wanted. It was a lot more than I wanted. I don't have that gift. But God had two men, and we see this in 31, 1 through 11, that he gave skills and talents and abilities and understanding. And these men crafted all of this that we just talked about. And the point here, as I want to make, is no matter who you are, God's given you talents, he's given you abilities, he's given you skills, he's given you a personality. And you don't have to be an ordained minister. You don't have to be, what the person you sit next to is. You have to be who God has made you. And then take that and think about your daily work and your daily tasks. That's how you worship God. That's how you minister for God, is looking at what he's given you and using that for his glory. So after all this was created and all this was set up, and Moses inspected it and approved of it, the people here who saw God's power defeating the Egyptians, they saw this pillar of fire and this cloud guide them. They saw God's glory descend on the mountain. They saw Moses come up and go back, and they saw the after effects of Moses, that he radiated God's glory. When the tabernacle was completed, when it was consecrated, meaning dedicated to God's use in chapter 40, then a cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of God filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travel of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire in the cloud by night, in the sight of all Israelites during the travels. Think about that. This wasn't an idea. This wasn't, oh, well, we're going to go through this act and pretend that God is there, and we think God's there, or he might be there. These people saw God's glory in the form of a great cloud in the daytime, right there, above the tabernacle in the Holy of Holies. And then at night, think about that. Because how they would do is they would take this tabernacle and they would set it up, and then they would form the camp around them. Again, we talked about, you take 1.5 million people, you're not putting them all in this room, right? Not even putting them in, the village of Odessa. They're spread out for miles. And the night sky, you look up and you can know where the tabernacle of God is by this fire in the sky. And then when you wake up in the morning, all of a sudden this cloud rises and it starts to move. and you follow that. And then when it settles, you set up the camp, you set up the tabernacle again. There was no way you should have doubted God. There was no way that you could argue that God wasn't with you. Keep that in mind in the next few weeks. We're going to do a little backtracking next week. Right after, just before and after this, that it boggles my mind that sometimes we humans, that no matter how much we're exposed to God, we still fail in our faith. And keep in mind, in a couple weeks, when the Israelites were of the land, again, the presence of God is clearly, undoubtedly there in the tabernacle. And what they did when it was time to cross into the promised land. All right, so next week, we're going to look at Exodus 32 through 33. We're going to wrap up Exodus. And we're also going to look at Leviticus 1 through 7 and then chapter 26. We're going to kind of do a highlight of Leviticus because I don't want us to get bogged down in the do's and the don'ts because we'll kind of cover the reason why for next week. So we're going to leave it there. Let's close and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for your presence. That sometimes though we doubt and though we fail to forget, your presence is with us everywhere we go. Father, remind us of that, especially as we come into worship in a few minutes, but also as we go about our day, that there is nowhere, no time that you aren't right there with us. Remind us of that, God. In your name, amen. 32 and 33. And we'll look a little bit at Leviticus. Yep.